Hello and welcome to RFA 6350. My name is Professor Mark Sanchez. I'll be with you over the next 6 weeks as we talk about the economic, political, and social influences on our food laws and food safety system. I've taught 6130, Introduction to Food Law, 6205, Regulatory Submissions, and 6110, Regulatory Life Cycle, which will be a similar course if you've had that with me as 6305. By this point in the program, you're familiar with concepts like USDA, FTA jurisdiction, what constitutes adulteration or misbranding, generally recognized as safe, and food additive petitions, color additives. The whole gamut of our system, in a nutshell, the nuts and bolts of it should be something that you're familiar with. Just in case, or if it's been a while since you've had those concepts introduced to you, I'm going to post 6130's week 1 and week 2 lectures so that we can all be on the same page by week 2, talking about economic, political, and social influences, typically on our two violations that we potentially have under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, adulteration and misbranding. As you can tell from the syllabus, our text for this quarter will be my food law text, which I wrote for the Introduction to Food Law course. There's 2 editions. The second edition may or may not be available by the time this course is posted, and that's okay if you have edition 1. The biggest change between this edition, edition 1 and edition 2, is the introduction of the Food Safety Modernization Act, and it's a very detailed new chapter on FSMA, going through all the 7 foundational rules and all the detail that's there. And that's for another course because we will not necessarily need to get into that level of detail here for FSMA. But FSMA is an example of a change in the law, a huge change, the first change in 60 or 70 some odd years. And we can talk about the social, economic, and political influences that led to FSMA. So in that sense, we will talk about FSMA, but we won't necessarily need to get into the nuts and bolts as what is in the second edition. So what I want to do in this first lecture is introduce myself as well as introduce the concepts that we will be talking about. Obviously, economic, political, social influences, we can begin to imagine what those are. But we can also take a look at some of our food items that we have around us all the time, which is fantastic with teaching a food law course because food is a common language. So one of the foods that I like to have at all points on my desk here in the office or at home is dark chocolate. You've always seen me post a video or 2 about dark chocolate. And it's a great place to look both on the label as well as in the ingredients panel to see economic, political, and social influences, both those that are existing and maybe as a barometer for those that are to be coming in the future. So here I have an equal exchange chocolate. It's listed as very dark and it gives the percentage as 71%. So this is all information for me as a consumer. One of the key features here is it has organic in the title and it has USDA organic emblem. So these are required components of the label. If you're going to make these claims, you need to go through the USDA NOP office to make those claims. The motivation for doing that is likely economic because these are hugely valuable claims to make, worth millions of dollars every year. We could talk about organic and all natural, very huge claims on the market, gluten-free, paleo, keto. All of these claims are economically driven. We don't have to make these claims, but if we do make them, there is some economic gain to make from that. And it's good to have a regulated system to do this, both from a consumer standpoint, so that we know when it says organic or USDA organic, or even a more serious situation like gluten-free, that it actually means something. And it's also something advantageous as a brand. If you're going to invest the time to go through the USDA NOP, you want some enforcement to go with that so that there's barriers to entry and that consumers can't make that claim for free. There are other claims on here. For example, the brand itself is equal exchange, and you may see other brands that talk about being fair trade. Those aren't required components of the label. There's not a USDA NOP office or an FDA CFSAN, Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition office, that requires those claims. But that could be an example in the final project where you talk about where food law is going into the future. And maybe there will be a USDA or FDA office that requires some sort of certification or process to go through to make those claims versus just a third-party organization having full control over theirs. We can also look at the ingredient label. This is using the old nutrition fact panel, but even the fact panel, we can look at economic, social, and political influences there. We have a new fact panel that's out. Still some time for all companies to comply with, But what are the economic, social, and political influences to our facts panel? I travel in Europe and I really prefer the European system for ingredient labeling and for nutrition labeling, in part because of the percentages that are given. So here we have the ingredients and they're listed in order of predominance. So organic chocolate liqueur is the first ingredient. That should be the one that there's the most of. Here at the end is organic ground vanilla beans. That should be the least ingredient. That much I can tell you from reading the label. Percentage-wise, well, the custom for chocolates at least is to label the percent of cocoa. So I can kind of guess from there, but everything apart from that, I really don't know the percentages or the values on that. So we can talk about that in this course. What are the economic, social, and political influences to the way we have the current system? And are there rumblings or signs of that changing in the future? We can also look at the ingredients themselves. This is a fairly whole food, so there's not a whole lot that we can talk about in terms of bromiated or hydrogenated or some other version of something or some chemical name. But there are products out there that have lots of ingredients in them. Bromiated vegetable oil is a really great example in a lot of citrus sodas, how that's banned in Europe but kept here in the United States as an interim food additive. It's not really a category we have. What are the social, political, economic influences for keeping BVO an ingredient? We'll talk about aspartame as another example of an ingredient that has some political motivation perhaps to why it's still permitted as a food additive. So there's a lot that we can talk about, even just taking one example from a favorite food that we have and looking at the ingredients, looking at the labeling, and starting to speculate what the economic, political, and social influences are to having the product in the way that it is now, and also maybe seeing some ways that it could change in the future. And that's what we're going to do through the course, and it's what we're going to do through the assignments. So we'll start by taking a current example, and we'll work our way towards the future to forecasting what that could be. Maybe it's something like fair trade, maybe it's a unified food agency. We can talk about whatever we'd like there. And we don't have to limit ourselves to food additives directly. We can limit ourselves, we can expand our discussion to indirect food additives. And here's an example from one of my hobbies is to make molded chocolates. And so I have chocolate pyramids here, which goes along with the Fayum portrait of the Serapis priest that I have in the office. And with indirect food additives, what we want is basically an inert substance. We want no interaction with our food packaging or our food products, such as chocolate molds, with our actual products. So in this case, I want this chocolate mold to simply impart the nice pyramid shape into the tempered chocolate, and no BPA, no other leached chemicals or other substances should be a part of that. It should simply be the shape, and it should release, and it should be completely free of that. There are examples of indirect food additives that leach into food, BPA being a really big example, but we could think of others. There can be color additives, cochineal beetles causing a big stir when they were used in Starbucks, strawberry frappuccino, because some people didn't realize they were there, and if they were vegan or kosher, that could cause issues. So it can be indirect food additives, it can be things like impart color, like color additives. The scope of our discussion can be very broad, and so I want you to bear that in mind, because I know some of you are coming from facilities where you've worked with a particular ingredient for a very long time or a suite of products for a very long time, and you may think of these issues through that scope. And what we need to do in this course is expand the scope, look at things very broadly, both in terms of the types of products that we're looking at, as well as the scope of time that we're looking at. If we're looking at our history of our food law system, it really begins with Upton Sinclair raising awareness and beginning a political and social movement to change our food law and actually have the first pure food and drug law that we did have. Then the progress of that to get into the 1934 amendments, all the way to the FSMA amendments, the color additive amendments, all these things that we can talk about that really rely on history. So it's a great time if you're a history buff or if you haven't really delved into our food safety history. This is a good time to do that because we're going to talk about all the economic, political, and social influences. And to do that, we really have to go back in time and see some of the instances of what happened. So clearly a lot to talk about over the next 6 weeks. It's going to be fast-paced, but I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So if you haven't already, take the time to participate in the discussion board, and be sure if you need to catch up on week 1 and week 2 lectures from 6130, Introduction to Food Law. That's also your reading assignment in the textbook. So that way, when we get into week 2 and we're talking about the economic influences, we can get into that lingo of adulteration, misbranding, all those concepts without having to go back and define those first, and we'll be ready to go. So enjoy this time catching up on some old material, and we'll catch up next week for some new material.